I spent 40 years working with pressure systems, boilers, hydraulic lines, industrial compressors the size of a small house. The one thing every young engineer learns on his first day, the one thing you never forget, is that pressure doesn't announce itself. It builds quietly, behind the walls, behind the gauges, behind the polished surfaces that make everything look fine. By the time you hear the warning, it's usually already too late to stop what's coming. I know that now better than I ever did standing on a factory floor. My name is Daniel. I'm 63 years old. I live in a house I built with my own hands on 5 acres outside of Beaumont, Texas. And I've spent the better part of the last decade watching the people I loved most treat that house and everything in it, including me, like a storage unit they hadn't gotten around to emptying yet. This is the story of how I finally turned off the pressure valve, and what happened when they came home to find the tank completely empty. I need to go back a few years to make you understand how we got here, because none of this happened overnight. That's the part people miss when they hear a story like mine. They want to jump straight to the drama, the confrontation, the moment everything exploded. But pressure systems don't work that way. And neither do families. My son Ryan was 34 when this started. Tall, handsome kid. Looked just like his mother did when I married her. Dark hair, easy smile. The kind of face that made people trust him before he'd said a single word. He worked in commercial real estate, made decent money, spent better money. His wife Ashley was a few years younger, pretty in that particular way that always seemed to require a great deal of maintenance. And she had opinions about everything. What car Ryan should drive, what neighborhood they should live in, what his father's retirement funds should be earmarked for. That last one took a few years to surface fully. But looking back, the signs were there from the beginning. My wife Carol and I had been married 31 years when Ryan first brought Ashley home for Thanksgiving. Carol liked her immediately. I was more cautious. There was something in the way Ashley looked at our property, the land, the workshop, the truck in the driveway that reminded me of the way a building inspector looks at a structure he's planning to condemn. Calculating, appraising, taking inventory. But she made Ryan happy. Or at least, she made Ryan feel like he was winning at something. And in those early years, that felt like enough. The loan requests started small. Ryan needed help with a down payment on their first house. Carol and I talked it over, decided it was a wedding gift in spirit, wrote the check. 2 years later, Ashley wanted to open a boutique skincare products, luxury candles, that kind of thing. She had a business plan, she said. She had a vision. What she needed was capital. $50,000. I told Ryan I'd think about it. That same evening, Ashley called me directly, not Carol, me, and spent 45 minutes explaining why this investment made sense. She used words like equity stake and first mover advantage and generational wealth building. I remember sitting in my workshop after the call, turning a piece of scrap metal over in my hands, trying to decide what I was actually hearing. Was this a daughter-in-law asking her father-in-law for help? Or was this a negotiation? I gave her the money. The boutique lasted 14 months. There was never a conversation about paying it back. When I brought it up, gently, over dinner one Christmas, Ashley smiled at me with that particular smile she had. Patient, slightly condescending, the smile of someone who has already decided you're being unreasonable and said, "Dad, we're family. We don't keep score." I noticed she called me Dad for the first time that day. Funny how that works. Carol didn't see it the way I did. Carol loved having Ryan close by, loved having Ashley at the house for Sunday dinners, loved the idea of grandchildren that Ashley occasionally floated but never seemed to be in any actual hurry to produce. Carol had grown up poor, and I think some part of her genuinely believed that giving freely was proof that we had made it. That generosity was its own reward. I loved her for that. I also watched it cost us. Slowly, steadily, the way a slow leak costs you, not in one dramatic rush, but in a gradual, almost invisible draining. By my 61st birthday, Ryan and Ashley had borrowed, and I use that word, with full awareness of its inaccuracy, a total of somewhere around $220,000 from us, over 7 years. I had kept records. I kept records of everything. That was the engineer in me. I had a folder on my computer, password protected, that cataloged every transfer, every check, every loan with a date and amount. Ryan didn't know about that folder. Ashley certainly didn't. I also kept records of something else. 3 separate times over those years, I had noticed irregularities in our joint account with Carol, withdrawals I hadn't made, transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. Each time I'd brought it up with Carol, she'd had an explanation. She'd moved money to cover a surprise for my birthday. She'd lent Ashley something for a medical bill and hadn't mentioned it. She'd transferred funds to a savings account she was building for the grandchildren we didn't have yet. I believed her. Or maybe I wanted to believe her. There's a difference. And I understand that difference now. In a way I didn't then. The stroke happened on a Thursday evening in April. I had been in my workshop. I spend most evenings out there. Always have. It's where I think, working on a restoration project, an old engine I'd been rebuilding for 8 months. I remember feeling odd around 6 o'clock. Not painful, exactly, just wrong. Like a gyroscope that's slightly off its axis. A vibration that shouldn't be there. I sat down on the stool by my workbench and tried to figure out what I was feeling, and that's the last clear thing I remember for a while. My neighbor Marcus found me. He's 71, a retired electrician, lives about a quarter-mile down the road, and he had driven over to return a socket set he'd borrowed. He told me later he'd found me on the floor of the workshop, unable to speak clearly, the right side of my face drooping. He called 911 and rode in the ambulance with me because there was nobody else. That detail stayed with me afterward, during the long, strange hours in the hospital. Marcus rode in the ambulance because there was nobody else. Where was everyone else? Ryan and Ashley were in Scottsdale, Arizona. Ryan had just been promoted to regional director at his firm. A legitimate achievement. I want to be fair, and Ashley had organized a long weekend at a resort to celebrate. They'd left Tuesday. The plan was to come back Sunday. When the hospital called Ryan's cell phone, Ashley answered. The attending nurse explained the situation: stroke. Stable but serious. Father-in-law was asking for family. I wasn't asking for anyone. I learned later. I was barely conscious and couldn't speak. But that's what the nurse said. And it was true enough in spirit. Ashley told the nurse they would figure out logistics and call back. She did not call back. Marcus sat in the waiting room for 6 hours. He's not a man who makes a fuss about things. He brought a paperback novel and a thermos of coffee, and he sat there, the way a good man sits somewhere when he's needed. When I was moved to a regular room the next morning and could speak again, slowly, carefully, the words coming out like I was pushing them through wet concrete, he was the one who told me what had happened, that the hospital had called Ryan, that Ryan and Ashley had not come. I asked about Carol. Marcus looked at the window for a moment. Then he told me that Carol had also been called, that Carol had said she was tired and would come in the morning. I lay there in that hospital bed and listened to the machines doing their steady, indifferent work, and I felt something shift inside me. Not break. I want to be precise about that, because it matters. Things breaking is loud and sudden and dramatic. This was quieter. This was more like a load-bearing wall finally acknowledging what the cracks had been saying for years. Carol came the next morning. She brought flowers, yellow tulips, my least favorite. She'd never remembered my least favorite. And she hugged me with the particular energy of someone who wants the scene to go quickly. She asked how I was feeling. She said she'd been so worried. She said she hadn't slept. I looked at her, and I thought about 31 years. I thought about the $220,000. I thought about the 3 account discrepancies I had filed away and chosen not to examine too closely. I thought about Marcus sitting in a waiting room with a thermos of coffee at 2 in the morning. I said I was fine. I said I was glad she was here. I did not say any of the other things I was thinking. That was intentional. Ryan and Ashley arrived Saturday afternoon, 2 days after the stroke. 1 day before, they were originally scheduled to leave Scottsdale anyway. They came directly from the airport, still tan, Ashley wearing a sundress, Ryan carrying a gift shop bag with a card in it. They were cheerful in the specific way people are cheerful when they know they should be apologetic and have decided that cheerfulness is a reasonable substitute. Ryan squeezed my arm and said, "You gave us a scare, Dad." I gave them a scare. Ashley said the resort had been beautiful, but she'd been so distracted worrying about me that she'd barely enjoyed it. I thought about the nurse who had called her. I thought about figure out logistics. I kept my face neutral. I was good at keeping my face neutral. I'd been practicing for years without fully realizing it. They stayed for an hour and a half. Ryan spent 40 minutes of that on his phone in the hallway. Here is what I did not do. I did not yell. I did not accuse. I did not have a dramatic confrontation in my hospital room. I have seen enough old machinery to know that when you want to dismantle something properly, you don't take a sledgehammer to it. You find the right bolt, the right sequence, and you work methodically, and you do not let the machine know what you're doing until it's already done. I spent 8 days in that hospital. Then I spent 3 weeks in a rehabilitation facility in Beaumont that my insurance covered and my accountant had recommended when I'd had the foresight, years ago, to put it in my supplemental plan. During those 3 weeks, while Carol visited twice in 3 weeks, and Ryan called on weekends if I was lucky, I did a great deal of thinking. I also did a great deal of reading. Legal documents, primarily, account statements, property records, that password-protected folder on my laptop, which Marcus had brought me along with a change of clothes and my reading glasses. It was in that folder. Cross-referencing dates I had recorded against bank statements I had Marcus retrieve from my filing cabinet at home, that I found what I should have found years earlier. The account discrepancies weren't Carol moving money for surprises or medical bills. Over a period of approximately 4 years, Carol had transferred a total of $68,000 from our joint savings to a separate account that I had never seen. In her name. Only. Some of it had gone to Ashley's boutique, apparently on top of the $50,000 I already knew about. Some of it had gone to Ryan for reasons I could only speculate about. And a portion of it, about $11,000, had gone to an account I traced, with some help from a financial investigator I hired from my rehab room using nothing but a phone and the internet, to a company LLC registered in Ashley's maiden name. $11,000. Quietly bled out of our marriage and into Ashley's private pocket. I want to tell you I was devastated. I want to tell you I cried, or raged, or felt the ground come out from under me. The truth is, I felt something more like the specific calm that comes when a gauge finally confirms what you've known in your gut for a long time. Sad. Yes. But not surprised. Not anymore. I also want to tell you something about Marcus, because he deserves it. During those 3 weeks, he came to see me every other day. He brought food from the diner down the road, terrible coffee, excellent pie. And he sat with me and talked. Or didn't talk, depending on what I needed. He knew something was wrong beyond the stroke. He didn't push. He just showed up, the way he had in my workshop that Thursday night. Because showing up was what he understood to be the job. I told him everything eventually. All of it. The money, the account, the boutique, the resort, the ambulance. He listened, without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What are you going to do about it?" I told him I had some ideas. What I did carefully, and I did legally. And I want to be clear about both of those things. I am not a vindictive man by nature. I am a precise man. There's a difference. First, I contacted my attorney, a woman named Patricia, who had handled my business affairs for 15 years, and who had the particular quality I most admire in professionals: she listened more than she talked. I laid out everything. She was quiet for a long time after I finished, and then she said, "You've been documenting this for how long?" I told her. She said, "Good." Patricia drew up new estate documents. My original will had left everything: the house, the 5 acres, the workshop, my retirement accounts, a portfolio of municipal bonds I'd been quietly building for 12 years, split evenly between Carol and Ryan, with provisions for Ashley as Ryan's spouse. The new documents transferred the house and land into a trust controlled solely by me, with Marcus named as the successor trustee. My retirement accounts were redirected. My portfolio was restructured. A property I owned outright, a commercial lot in Beaumont, I'd bought as an investment 15 years ago, and which had appreciated considerably, was quietly deeded to a veterans housing nonprofit I'd been donating to for years. That last part wasn't revenge. That part just felt right. Patricia also helped me address the account irregularities. The transfers Carol had made weren't technically fraud in the criminal sense. Joint accounts are complicated, but they were grounds for specific legal remedies in the context of a divorce, which I had also instructed Patricia to begin filing, quietly, while I was still in the rehabilitation facility. While Carol was home in our house, presumably unaware that the foundation she was standing on had already been removed, I came home on a Wednesday. Carol picked me up, which surprised me. I had expected Marcus. She was warm, attentive, made dinner, fussed over my medication schedule. I watched her move around the kitchen I had built with my own hands, and I felt the full weight of 31 years, and I let myself feel it, because I think you owe that to a thing before you end it. Grief isn't weakness, it's acknowledgement. I slept in the guest room that night, citing my rehab routine. Carol accepted that without question, which told me something. The following week, Patricia filed the divorce papers. I was not home when Carol was served. I had driven to Marcus's house that morning, and we'd sat on his back porch and watched the cattle in the field behind his property and drank coffee and didn't talk much. My phone rang 3 times in an hour. I silenced it each time. There would be time to talk later. That morning was for the particular quiet you can only find when a decision has finally been made, and there is nothing left to do but let it complete itself. Ryan called that evening. He was angry, not the righteous anger of someone who has been wronged, but the specific, sputtering anger of someone who has been caught out and is trying to perform outrage instead. He said I was being unreasonable. He said I was punishing his mother for a mistake. He used the word family 7 times in 8 minutes. I counted because counting is what engineers do when they need to stay calm. He said that when I cooled down, I would see that this was an overreaction. I let him finish. Then I said, quietly and without heat, I need you to know something, Ryan. I kept records of everything. Every dollar, every transfer, every date. My attorney has copies. So before you call this an overreaction, I want you to think very carefully about the conversation you want to have next. Silence. Then, what do you mean? Records. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a man suddenly aware that the floor is not where he thought it was. Ashley called the next morning. She called 7 times before I picked up, and when I did, her tone was different from Ryan's, less angry, more careful, negotiating. She said there had been misunderstandings. She said she wanted to sit down and talk like adults. She said she loved me like a father. I said, I know about the LLC. Another silence. Longer than Ryan's. She said it wasn't what it looked like. I said I had a financial investigator who disagreed. She said she could explain. I said Patricia would be happy to hear her explanation in the appropriate setting. She said, and this is the part I still think about, Dad, you don't want to do this to your family. I said, I didn't do this to my family, Ashley. I hung up. The divorce took 7 months. I will not pretend it was painless. Nothing worth doing is. Carol hired an attorney who was aggressive in the early stages and then went quiet when Patricia produced the documented account transfers. There were negotiations. There were tense phone calls. There were 2 meetings in a conference room where I sat across from my wife of 31 years and watched us dismantle something that had once been real and good and was now, in its current form, neither. Carol got the car she had always driven. A portion of the joint savings that Patricia calculated was fair accounting for the transfers, and a monthly amount we agreed on that I will honor without complaint for the rest of my working life, because whatever she took, she also gave me 31 years, and I choose to remember that fairly. What she did not get was the house, the land, the workshop, the investment portfolio, or the commercial property that was by then already signed over. Ryan lost the support structure he had never valued while he had it. No more loans, no more gifts. When his lease on the overpriced apartment he and Ashley had moved into came due 18 months later, he called me. The call was different from the first one, quieter, more uncertain. He asked if we could talk. I said yes. We met for lunch at a diner in Beaumont. He came alone. Ashley did not. He looked tired, in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. We talked for 2 hours, and for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, we talked like two people, rather than like a man and his creditor. He didn't apologize. Not exactly. Not in the clean way you see in movies. But he said something near the end that I've turned over many times since. He said, "I think I stopped seeing you as a person a long time ago. I'm not sure when. I'm sorry about that. It wasn't enough to undo anything, but it was real, and I had learned by then to value real things." The commercial lot in Beaumont sold 18 months after I deeded it to the nonprofit, which used the proceeds to build 14 units of transitional housing for veterans in the county. I went to the dedication. Marcus came with me. We stood in the back of a small crowd and watched a man about my age cut a ribbon. And Marcus leaned over and said, "Didn't you own this land?" I said, "Used to." He nodded like that was a complete answer. With Marcus, it usually was. I want to tell you about the morning I woke up, about 4 months after the divorce was final, and walked out to my workshop before dawn. The air was cool, and the light was that particular Texas blue that happens right before the sun commits to rising, and I stood in the doorway of the space I'd built, and I looked at the engine I'd been restoring. The one I'd been working on the night the stroke happened, the one I'd never finished, and I picked up my tools and I started working again. There is a specific satisfaction in mechanical work that I have never been able to fully explain to anyone who hasn't experienced it. It's the satisfaction of a system functioning as designed, of things doing what they're supposed to do, of putting in the right input and receiving the expected output. Human beings are not machines, I know that. I've lived that, but there is something in the order of a well-maintained engine that feels, at least briefly, like the way things ought to be. I finished that restoration in June. It runs perfectly. Marcus has a daughter in San Antonio who has been gently suggesting for 2 years that her father and his neighbor ought to come visit sometime. We are going in the fall. I have no idea what that means or where it goes, and for the first time in a long time, not knowing doesn't feel like a problem. It feels like something else entirely. There are things I would do differently. I would have opened that folder years earlier. I would have had the hard conversation with Carol before it became the kind of conversation that happens in a lawyer's office. I would have said more, out loud, when it still might have changed something. I lived too long under the assumption that keeping the peace was the same as having peace. And those are not the same thing. They are, in fact, nearly opposites. But here is what I would not change. I would not change the 8 days I spent in that hospital, thinking clearly, for what felt like the first time in years. I would not change the folder, the records, the methodical accumulation of evidence that I never wanted to need. I would not change Marcus and his thermos of coffee and his paperback novel in a waiting room at 2 a.m. I would not change the moment I finally understood that a system cannot be repaired if you are not honest about where it's broken. Pressure doesn't announce itself. But if you've been paying attention, really paying attention, you can feel it building long before the gauges confirm it. The trick, the thing I wish someone had told me 40 years ago standing on my first factory floor, is that feeling it isn't enough. You have to do something with what you feel. You have to act before the whole thing comes apart. I acted. Late, maybe. But I acted. And the engine runs.